Welcome to the Anxious Child Podcast, the podcast that helps you best work with anxious kids and teens. Now, here's your host, Stephen Quinlan.
Hey everyone, today on the show we have Deborah Morgan. Deborah shares with us her inspiring story of struggle to get the best care possible for her son. Deborah's son was diagnosed when he was just 2 years old with an autoimmune disease, and she took it upon herself to gather as much information as she could and look for alternative treatments after she'd been told that there was nothing that could be done by her doctor. Deborah is at a place now where she has established a community of support for other parents who are going through similar situations. On the show today, Deborah and I talk about the connection between your gut and your brain and how healing your digestive system can have profound overall effects on other issues in your body, including anxiety and mental health. We talk specifically about a particular disorder which is known as PANS, or Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Syndrome, and we discuss some practical and easy ways to try and improve your kid's diet, even if they are a picky eater. Deborah's a very down-to-earth and practical speaker, and her knowledge is directly born out of her personal experience. It's a great episode, and I think there is a lot of information to take away here. One of the things I really appreciate about what Deborah has been able to establish is the community of parents that have been able to help each other. And I'm really excited to announce that I have started a private Facebook group, hopefully to that same end. I'll be in there all the time, posting articles and answering questions, and my goal is to foster a place of support and community and learning for people who are trying to do their best for their anxious kids. So if you're interested in checking that out, just search Anxious Child Podcast on Facebook, and we would love to have you join. So without further ado, here is me and Deborah Morgan. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being on today. I really am looking forward to learning. I know you have a lot of knowledge about the gut-brain connection, and so I'm excited to learn about that. I thought we could start with, I know you have personal connection to this as a self-described fierce mama bear, and the story of your son, which I was looking at a little bit. So I was wondering if we could start there.
Sure, absolutely. So my journey with my son started when he was 2 years old. And at that time, he was actually diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, not related to the brain, related to the skin, in fact. And we were really told there was nothing that we could do about it. We were just going to have to learn to live with it and manage the symptoms and get on with life, which felt really disappointing to me. And I remember feeling really powerless at that time, because here they're telling me that my son's body is attacking itself, essentially. And there's nothing that I can do, nothing that we can do, nothing that the medical system can do, and that potentially could get worse. And so that sort of started my journey down the rabbit hole, as I call it, because I went home and my husband and I both sort of started spending a lot of time with Dr. Google. And as any parent knows who's had any sort of diagnosis, or anybody who's had some sort of health condition, it's a big rabbit hole. Like, you go down there and you swim around for a long time in great confusion, right?
Yeah.
There's so much information, which is a blessing, right? In so many ways, but also a bit of a curse, because it's hard to weed through and see what's real, what makes sense, what's going to work, what's not harmful, what's just snake oil, all that kind of stuff. So I started reading a lot about the connection between the gut and all kinds of health conditions and how it relates to the immune system and the endocrine system and the nervous system, and reading a lot of testimonials. That was really big for me, of people who had autoimmune conditions and used gut healing approaches to really significantly improve their condition and their quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of life happenstance happened, and my meditation teacher introduced me to a functional medicine doctor who further reinforced for me that a big piece of this puzzle had to be the gut. So he sent us home with strict instructions on a very strict diet, which led me to cry in my car because I just thought, like, how on God's green earth am I going to make this work? Like, how are we going to do this and live a normal life and go to birthday parties and travel and visit our family in Mexico? But I did. Long story short, I sort of dove in, and within a couple of months, we started to notice that my son's health was better. He was that kid who, if he passed a neighbor on the street on the way to the mailbox who had a cold, he'd have it like 2 days later. He was just getting sick. All of it would get better, and 2 weeks later, he was sick again. It was just constant. And I didn't really put that together at the time with the autoimmune condition, but we started to notice that this was the first thing to change. Like, his immune system was suddenly a little bit more robust and responsive. And so that kind of had me sold on it to say, okay, I can stick with this for a bit longer here. And within just about the year mark, we started to notice an actual reversal of the skin condition, which is not supposed to be possible. And so I took the results to my doctor, and she was just blown away. She said, whatever you're doing, keep doing it, because it's working. And so we continued on that path for a long time. And it continued to get better. That condition is probably 95 to 98% reversed at this point. Now, my connection to the anxiety piece of it comes in where a few years ago, unfortunately, we got hit by some Lyme disease issues.
Oh, no.
So Lyme co-infections, and in the pediatric community, it's called pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndrome.
Oh, it's PANS.
Yeah. So then, the anxiety was one of the symptoms that came up. So that's something that I've also personally dealt with. And so we did all the treatments with that. We used antibiotics and a bunch of other things, but we got back to the foundations of the gut healing diet. And that really has helped, speed along his healing journey from all of those infections.
Okay. So initially he had the skin issue, which was the autoimmune disorder. And then later on down the road also had PANS, or PANDAS is sometimes the acronym.
Right. Yeah. So PANDAS is strep related, and PANS is other infections. So yes, so that's right. And it was triggered by various infections that he got from some sort of bug bite.
It's such an interesting disorder that really was not very well known, probably about even 10 years ago, which is about when I first heard of it. And it's pretty fascinating in that it can present as anxiety or OCD. It's almost seemingly out of nowhere, which is actually one of the hallmark traits, which can sort of allow you to maybe differentiate that from other kinds of anxiety issues.
Right.
So I think it's a great thing to let people know about who aren't familiar with. So could you speak on that a little bit, and kind of what your journey with that was like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important that people know. It's fascinating to me that there's more and more research coming out now that is showing a link between mental illness of all kinds, depression, anxiety, even schizophrenia, and chronic inflammation in the body, as well as potentially some of these infectious triggers. And some of this research has been spurred by accident, when people who have terrible mental illnesses with schizophrenia and hallucinations and things, and they get sick and need to go on antibiotics, and their symptoms are better.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started looking at this correlation between the immune system and mental health. So I think it's really something that we need to keep in mind. I'm not saying it's the underlying cause for everybody, but I think it's there. So there's the infectious side of it, and then there's also just the chronic inflammation side of it. And the chronic inflammation side is where we have control as parents, that we can do something to help decrease the inflammation in the body, which then helps the brain to kind of get back to better balance. So absolutely, the sudden onset is one of typically the hallmark sort of diagnostic criteria for
Mm-hmm.
PANS or PANDAS. However, we are seeing that it doesn't always have to be the case that is the sudden onset of all of the symptoms. So sometimes we're seeing parents who are saying, well, my child's always been slightly anxious, or excuse me, a little frog in my throat, or had mild OCD symptoms or motor tics, for example. But then suddenly something sort of tips it over the edge, where we see an onset of additional symptoms and a worsening. So rages are a big one with the PANS and PANDAS community. So, when talking with parents, I always say, just because all of this didn't all of a sudden all happen right at once doesn't necessarily mean we throw the PANS possibility out the window. And that's where it's really important to be able to find like a Lyme literate, PANS literate doctor,
Mm-hmm.
or a naturopath, or somebody that you can work with that can get you the, appropriate testing. There's no specific diagnostic test for PANS or PANDAS, but together with symptoms and some testing, they can kind of piece it together and see if that could be what's going on.
Yeah. And I know of a naturopath and sort of my community who's very well versed in that I'll send people to, because I've found that there is a little bit of a tendency of the medical establishment to poo-poo a lot of these testing things, and it's very straightforward. It's really just a blood test, and you're looking for certain markers, but
yeah.
Sometimes doctors won't want to do that if they themselves aren't versed in this, or they feel it goes sort of counter to that medical establishment. And so you can get some pushback there. So
for sure,
a lot of times I think you're better off going to somebody who's, as you're saying, is already sort of versed in this. So you don't have to
educate,
verse them in it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I had an experience with that. We're very lucky that our regular family doctor was fairly knowledgeable about this, but she did refer us on, said if we should test for Lyme, but she said don't bother doing it through just the regular labs that you would get, because they only test for a couple of different bacteria, and that's not comprehensive enough. So she did refer us out for that. But we had to go to a walk-in clinic one day, and I told them that he was diagnosed with PANS and PANDAS, and the doctor told me that it didn't exist, that it was all in his head, that he needed to go to a home here for troubled kids.
Oh, man.
And I said, well, can we not just, in this case, we were looking for strep at that point, can we not just do the rapid test for strep? He said, the best I can do for you is to do a white blood cell count test, and if it comes back elevated, then we'll test further. And the problem with that is when we were originally diagnosed, his white blood cell count was down because these infections, some of the Lyme infections that we didn't know were there at the time, were suppressing his immune system. So if we had simply relied on the white blood cell test, it would have showed there was nothing. But in fact, it was because of these infections that the white blood cell test was down and was not a reliable test. But again, I was in the situation of having to educate, and I just didn't bother. I just said, okay, we're done here. This is obviously not the place for us to be, and went and found somebody who could, relate to us. And we ended up going back to our functional medicine practitioner, and that's who, was really able to get us on the path that we needed to be on.
Mm-hmm. So much of your story is being able to advocate for your child and also for yourself, which is very inspiring that you've been able to do that and you've kind of established this community of trying to help other people do that. What do you say to people who feel like maybe they just don't have that in them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's amazing what we have in us when it comes to our kids.
Yeah.
I'm not a majorly confrontational person.
Yeah.
I'm not somebody who really likes to go against the grain. Uh, if this had been my own health journey, I'm not sure I would have been as brave maybe as I have been, but because it's my child,
Mm-hmm.
that instinct, that mama bear sort of fire kind of comes up, and you do what you need to do. It doesn't mean it's comfortable all the time. I have to give myself pep talks, in that doctor's office, of holding it together, and talking to people about the diet that we do, going to restaurants. When we first changed our diet, having to have conversations with friends and family, like grandparents, and saying, no, they can't have that just once in a while right now. That was tough. It was. And I needed to, give myself a little pep talk. Knowing that I had my husband's support for me was important, or even just somebody else in your life that gets it. And that's why for me, starting this community was important, because being with other parents who get the journey, and who've had those tough conversations or confrontations with family members, and being able to just, come on the group and rant about it and get support is really important. Or say, look, I've got this tough thing coming up. Like, how do I deal with this? And just getting input from other parents who walk the same path is hugely valuable. Otherwise, you can feel kind of alone
Mm-hmm.
on it. And
Mm-hmm.
I was really fortunate, because when I was doing it, I had a friend whose son was diagnosed with fairly serious autism, and she was using a lot of the same approaches. So we were a good support system for each other. And I'm not sure I could have gotten through it without her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fortunately, there's a lot more resources out there. A lot more people are sort of involved and interested in the gut health and what it can do. But yeah, that's really why I've started the community, is that support for people to be the advocate that they need to be, and give each other the pep talks that we need sometimes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the questions I was going to ask you about actually is because there is so much more knowledge and media exposure to this connection between the brain and the gut, and even these mental health conditions and the gut. Do you have any sense as to where that comes from and why now? I mean, it's sort of analogous to the whole PANS issue that was never even heard of prior to, a decade or so ago. But now it seems like there's this explosion of research and awareness around these things. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's partially just a way the mainstream medical model works. It's sort of it's a few years behind always, in catching on to some of these newer ideas and maybe more holistic approaches. Right? It doesn't necessarily serve our mainstream medical model to pay a lot of attention to some of this stuff, because there's no profit behind it. And that's an unfortunate thing to say, but it's true, that in a profit-driven medical system, there is not a lot of incentive to look into something as simple as changing your diet and eating, foods that are supporting your microbiome. Like, it's just not there.
Right.
But, I think the research that's happening is happening in academic circles that have looked at this, and I think we're getting people who are open to looking at alternatives, and the academics are looking at this like, wow, this microbiome thing is fascinating from an academic point of view. Like, of all the different connections and things that it does, we have no idea of some of the things that these little critters are doing and how they're communicating with our body. They're considering it an actual organ in our body in and of itself now. And that's coming from fueled by the academic research that's really interested in learning more of it. And then the academic starts to kind of filter down into the medical model. But the everyday on the ground experience of it in the medical system, like it's in the media and we're hearing about it that way, that again coming from the academic side. But if you walk into your doctor's office and say, well, look, I've been thinking about doing some gut healing, they would still not have a clue how to guide you on that, or whether it's really going to help, or how it helps, or any of that, because they don't have the time, right, to sit down and read all the academic research. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, it's kind of a broad general question. I just find it so interesting that it seems like there's nothing for a long time along these, I guess, sort of ideas, and then all of a sudden there's this explosion and it's like everywhere. And I suppose maybe just sort of the progression of how ideas happen in general, and like a tipping point of awareness that it goes viral in a way, and then all of a sudden is everywhere. So I'm curious if you can try to explain the connection between gut health and your brain, and specifically in terms of anxiety for people to understand, because I think it can potentially be very complicated. And there's also something that it almost feels a little bit weird when you're talking about it, because like you were just saying a minute ago about how, there are these little kinds of organism things and sort of talking to each other in your belly. And then there's flora that's in there. And like, what is that all about? And can you try to explain that, or how do you try to explain that to people in a way that they can kind of wrap their brains around it?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll make it, what I do is try to make everything as approachable as possible when it comes to this, and not too overwhelming and mind-boggling. So I'll just hit on a couple of sort of key points. But so we talked a little bit about that inflammation factor when we first started chatting, and the inflammation piece is really related to gut health. So we know now that chronic inflammation in the body is connected to all kinds of chronic illness, including mental health issues. And so one of the major ways that we can kind of turn off a big tap of inflammation in the body is dealing with the gut. And the reason for that is that 70 to 80% of the immune system is actually around the gut. And so when I talk about the gut, I'm talking about the intestines. Excuse me, we've had so much smoke in our area from wildfires.
I've heard about that. Yeah.
Yes, it's just getting me a little bit these days.
That's okay.
So I'm sorry, I keep having to clear my throat.
It's okay.
Anyway, so 70 to 80% of the immune system is sitting around the intestines here. So what can happen is when we have an imbalance in our gut bugs, so that's the microflora. So the microflora is the organisms that live inside of our intestines, and this is necessary. We have a balance of good bacteria, bad bacteria, and opportunistic bacteria. That's my layman's terms for them. And of course, we want to have a better we want to have more good guys than all the other guys. But what can happen is through our diet, through the way we were born, through the foods we first ate, through antibiotics and many things, the microflora can become imbalanced. Even the water we drink, all kinds of things are contributing to the balance of these bugs. And so instead of having the beneficial flora being the most in our gut, we start to give an over-colonization of the bad guys and the opportunistic guys. And what happens then is the little cells that line our intestines depend on the good bacteria for their health. And so if they're not healthy, because the flora is imbalanced, they're not digesting food properly. That's a big one. So we can actually see people who are malnourished, who live in North America, who are eating a lot of food, but they're not able to digest it and use it properly because their microflora is imbalanced and their intestinal cells aren't working properly. But the other really important thing that these intestinal cells do is they form a barrier that protects the body from the outside world. So I refer to these little cells as like little bouncers at a nightclub. And they're linked arms, they're holding hands really tightly. And they decide, so your child eats something, it goes through the stomach and then it reaches the small intestine where the rest of digestion happens. And these cells are helping to digest it, but they're also deciding, okay, you have the right code, you're broken down enough into small enough pieces, you're allowed to filter through the intestine out into the body party. And all the molecules want to get out into the body party, but only certain molecules with the right code are allowed to get past. So then a toxin comes along and these cells go, you don't have the right code, you don't belong in this party, carry on. And it gets sent down into the large intestine and out with the next bowel movement. The same thing happens for bacteria and viruses. They're rejected at the gates and they're eliminated from the body. Now, what happens when we have the imbalanced microflora and these intestinal cells aren't working very well? So then that's like our bouncers are getting a little lazy and they're not holding hands as strongly anymore. And they're not quite as picky about the codes anymore. So then we get a little piece of undigested food particle that's not broken down into its tiniest little piece, and it's allowed to pass through into the bloodstream, which is not supposed to happen. That's where food allergies and sensitivities come from. Or a bacteria or a virus or a toxin, whatever it is, it's able to sneak past those bouncers and out into the bloodstream. Now, remember, 70 to 80% of the immune system is just sitting there around the gut. And this is like the sentry. It's like the armed guards sitting there waiting for something to go wrong. And one of these little pieces comes through, let's say it's a food particle, and it doesn't have the right code. So this sentry is like, wait, you're not supposed to be here. It calls in for the rest of the troops and mounts a full-blown attack. And what that attack looks like is inflammation to wall it off. Okay. Now that's good in the short term. We want it to be doing that in the short term, right? But imagine this going on every day, day in, day out, things leaking out of the gut that shouldn't be there, the immune system attacking it, inflammation going on and on and on. That's a lot of inflammation for the body to have to be dealing with. And that's an immune system that's overburdened and distracted. So this is why the gut can be one major source of inflammation in the body, that as parents, we really have the ability to just turn that tap off by helping to balance the microbiome and heal those intestinal cells so that your child is digesting their food properly. And then they're actually able to use the nutrients. And we can talk a little bit about some of the nutrient deficiencies that are sometimes related to anxiety. So they're able to actually use the nutrients in their food, but also you're turning off the leak so that you're not getting this chronic inflammatory state. Okay, so that's one big piece of it. Then the other side of it is the actual gut bugs themselves that can communicate with your neuroendocrine system. So we're not even sure exactly how this communication goes on, but there is direct two-way communication that goes on between the brain and the gut bugs. And so some of the pathogenic species have the ability to send the message to the brain to increase inflammation. So again, that's working against us. They also are involved with helping to produce neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are the chemicals that can communicate in our brain. So the majority of our neurotransmitters are actually produced in the gut. And the types of neurotransmitters that are produced are dependent on the types of bacteria we have in our gut. So GABA, for example, maybe you've heard of GABA as an amino acid that is also a neurotransmitter. And this is our calming neurotransmitter, right? It doesn't make us feel sleepy, but it just gives us that sort of calm Zen sort of feel. So we need certain species, beneficial species in our gut in order to be able to produce GABA. If we have other pathogenic species in our gut, they may be overproducing dopamine, which dopamine is a good neurotransmitter. We want it. It's the happiness neurotransmitter, but in large enough quantities, it can make us feel anxious. It can lead to motor tics and other things like this. So it's really very complex, but suffice it to say that when we look at the gut as parents with an anxious child, what we want to do is balance that microbiome so it's producing the right kinds of neurotransmitters so the intestinal cells can digest food properly and so that we're helping decrease inflammation. Does that kind of give a good
absolutely.
picture?
Yeah, thank you. And I know it's complicated, and to be able to present it in an easily digestible, no pun intended, fashion is very difficult. And it's just so fascinating that there are these tiny little bugs who can communicate with your brain inside your body. I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing to even think about. And maybe for some people, as we were talking about earlier, to even buy it, that's actually taking place,
Happening.
Right. Despite that's what we, the research is telling us. So given that you maybe are a parent and you have some concerns around this stuff, and you've talked a lot about there are the things that you can control as a parent, which are diet and also environment. Just looking at the first part of that, what are some suggestions that you would make to parents around diet if they feel this is an issue for their child and they've gone through the testing, etc.? What are some things you would suggest? And I guess I'm curious also too about how to present this to the kids in a way that they have food sensitivities or sensory issues or something that might be impact, or just picky eaters. So how to kind of work around that? I guess that's kind of a twofold question.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm asking you
absolutely.
these really big questions
That's
are
okay.
maybe sort of difficult to answer, but I'm
That's
curious.
okay. So I tell you what, I'll address the first question, the diet side of it. And then if I forget, because I get all wrapped up in what I'm talking about, to come back, because that is such an important piece of it, that how to address or present it to your kids, please remind me.
I will.
To come back to that.
Okay.
So the first and biggest thing, well, let me back up for a second and say, I don't even think you need to wait for any kind of testing to try this, because there is no harm in doing, any of this. It's not invasive. There's no side effects, right? You might as well give it a shot and see if it helps. And each child is individual in terms of how deep they need to go into the gut healing. So the first step is always whole foods based. So just focusing on real food and cutting down or eliminating, preferably eliminating, the processed foods from our diet. So the processed sugars absolutely has to go. Processed seed oils, like canola oils and sunflower oils, and some of these that are just sitting on the grocery store shelves for years and years at a time, those need to go. Very inflammatory. And then I would also say trying to focus on non-genetically modified foods, because we're just not sure. The research isn't strong on either side, but there's doubt in terms of what some of these genetically modified foods, like corn, for example, that has pesticide right in it, how that's affecting our microbiome, because they're bacteria, essentially, right? So those are the first things, is just really focusing on getting as whole foods as you possibly can. And I work with what I call my green light, yellow light, red light foods list. And so the yellow light foods are things like dairy. For some people, that's an okay and healthy food. For other people, it's complicated. So these are foods that you consider taking out for a time to see if your child does better. Legumes, considered a very healthy food. Whole grains. We hear all the time about eating a whole grains diet, which can be for some people a healthy way of living. However, grains and legumes require a very robust microbiome in order to be able to digest them, because they come with a coating on them that's called lectins. So it's written about quite a lot in the book called The Plant Paradox. So anything that's like a seed that you could plant and it would grow, has these lectins on it. And it's designed to protect it so that in nature, when we're eating these foods, as people that were roaming and grazing as well as the animals were, then when we had a bowel movement, they would come out in the bowel movement with all the fertilizer they needed and regrow. So it's a survival mechanism of the plant. So that works for the plant, doesn't really work well for us. So these are really hard to break down and digest in the gut. And so what happens is they end up sitting in the gut for a really long time. And this is perfect breeding ground for those opportunistic and pathogenic bacteria, because they just sit there and feast on this carbohydrate, essentially, that's sitting around in the gut. So we sometimes need to take those foods out for a time for some kids. So that's taking out all the whole grains and the legumes, so that we can reset the gut and allow it to just kind of have a rest and allow those digestive enzymes and intestinal cells to get back to their vigorous selves. And then we can sometimes bring them back into the diet. The other thing that the lectins do is they actually block the absorption of zinc. So zinc is one of those nutrients that people with anxiety are often a little bit deficient in. So we don't want to be doing anything that's going to prevent us from being able to absorb zinc.
Okay.
So now the red light foods are processed sugar, as I mentioned, processed oils. Gluten is also on the red light. Just really need to cut it out for a time list, and just see how you do. It's getting easier and easier to cut gluten out of your diet.
Yep.
And so obviously wheat is a grain, so it's going to have the lectins. But the other problem with wheat is that we do know through the research that even people who are non-celiac can react to wheat. And what happens is it increases the excretion of zonulin. And what zonulin does is it relaxes semi-permeable membranes. So when we talked about those bouncers being really tight, so if you eat gluten, it has a reaction on those cells. The zonulin reacts with those cells, making them a little bit lazy for a time in everybody. So for some people, that's not a big deal and their bodies can handle it. For other people, it is a big deal. And if you have this chronic inflammation and the various other things going on, having that gluten, even once in a while, is enough to just boost up that inflammation factor enough that it's causing problems. So we take the gluten out of the diet for a time, again, resetting the gut, allowing it time to kind of relax and restore. And then, once you start to see a difference in symptoms, you're able to say, okay, this is improving. Let's stick with it for a little longer. And then there comes a time where you say, okay, I think we're in a pretty good place. Let's start trying some of these foods in a very systematic way, not like make a salad and throw all the stuff in it that you've not had for the past, 6 months, but one at a time, start trying individual foods and just tracking and noticing symptoms. Because sometimes there are foods that we can bring back in and we're okay. And sometimes there's foods that we need to avoid on a more long-term basis. And sometimes there's foods we can be okay with in small amounts, but not larger amounts. And it's very individual for different people. And that's frustrating for some people, but nutrition is not an exact science in terms of everybody should do this.
Right.
It's quite individual, and it's about figuring out what your happy place is or what your child's happy place is.
It reminds me a little bit of if somebody has an allergy and you kind of take all the things out and away and then slowly reintroduce things and then just kind of see what happens with that. And chances are, you put the allergen back in and then, oh, there it is. And there's no denying that that's what it is. And that's how you figure it out. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly what this is. So this is sort of a combination of an elimination diet that's helping you to figure out what foods may be specific triggers, while at the same time helping to do the work of healing the gut. Because as long as you're continuing to consume foods that are a trigger for you, like let's say it's gluten, as long as you're consuming that food, your gut can't heal because it's constantly reacting to that food. So you need to take it out for a time. Yeah. And then you do the work of reintroducing it.
Coming back in. Okay. So my other question about presenting this to the kids, and your kid, I mean, it's the classic, my kid only eats macaroni and cheese, or my kid only eats pizza, or whatever. How do you work with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's such an important part of this. And if I can, I would just like to give 2 more points on the food side of it,
Please.
of things that I think are really important that parents understand. And one of them is histamine. So this again is getting more and more attention in the alternative medicine world. So a histamine intolerance. So histamine is natural in our body. We need it. Our bodies produce it. It's related to allergies. So if you have allergies, your body's already producing a little bit more histamine, but we need it for stomach acid. Like it tells our stomach to produce acid to digest, but it's also a neurotransmitter. So we are seeing that some people who have anxiety have a little bit of an overload of histamine in their body. So their histamine bucket's a little bit too full. And what we need to do is help that bucket sort of empty out a little bit. It's not about getting rid of histamine, it's just about helping it not be overflowing. And so some foods like the processed meats, like sandwich meats, are very high in histamine. Aged cheeses, like a cheddar cheese, is very high in histamine. There's quite a long list, but those are the big ones. Soy sauce, some types of vinegars are high in histamine, and fermented foods. And there's a bit of a paradox, because fermented foods are something we hear, and I work with so many parents who have kids with eczema, allergies, asthma, and anxiety tend to go together, that have started a gut healing diet on their own and started eating immense amounts of fermented food, because that's what all the literature tells you you're supposed to do. And technically, yes, because it has all the good bacteria that we want, right? But if you happen to have a histamine intolerance going on, which a lot of our kiddos do, then that's actually working against you. You're doing some good stuff for the flora, but you're just filling that histamine bucket up so full that you're overwhelming the system, and the histamine is causing the anxiety. So I've seen increase in symptoms from people starting a gut healing diet on their own, and they make this mistake. So I'm not saying don't do fermented foods, but do them, start very slowly, like with 1/4 of a teaspoon, and really notice how your child's responding to that. And if you notice an uptick in symptoms, then it's time to just not do the fermented foods. Focus on doing the healing of the gut in terms of the foods that you're eliminating. And then with time, you can start trying to reintroduce, because you're going to start emptying the bucket a little bit more that way. And then that bucket might be able to take some of those fermented foods back into it. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes me think of the kombucha or however it is that you sell, like the drink, and that I've heard
very popular.
It is very popular, and it's probiotic, right? So that's got to be good that you're kind of putting in these positive things. I think I read somewhere that as Americans, we tend to overdo this, that people get these giant bottles of, us with our like 2-liter soda bottles and whatever, but and then that's too much. And then it becomes not positive.
Well, exactly. Yes. Yeah. 100%. So it's always a good idea to start slowly with these things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you going to talk also about, is it dysbiosis? Is that one of the things
so
related
I actually
to anxiety?
Didn't use the word, but when I talked about the imbalance in the microflora in the gut bugs, that is dysbiosis. So dysbiosis is when we have more opportunistic and pathogenic species than the good guys.
Gotcha.
So and the other little piece with this, in terms of quick things with food, when we take out processed foods, a bonus is we often also eliminate the preservatives, the artificial flavors, and all of those things that can be triggers for our kids. And the reason behind that is that many of them are like a free glutamate. So lots of people have heard about MSG, and lots of parents have probably experienced that their kids maybe react poorly to MSG in foods, but MSG can be hidden in something that's called artificial flavor. And even you have to be careful of natural flavor. So, those drinks that you can get now, what are they called? Bublés or bubblies or something? They're just
Like a
carbonated water and
seltzer.
natural
Yeah.
flavor.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And my son really likes those. And there's something that he can have, but not all the time, because the natural flavor is a free glutamate, and he's able to tolerate a certain amount of it. If he starts to have too much of it, we notice a bit of an increase in some of his symptoms.
Huh.
So it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, now on
Yeah.
to the part
Okay.
about how to deal with
Okay.
your
All right. How do we do that?
Yeah, so it's tricky, I know, and this is the one thing that can really prevent a lot of parents from going down this road. But one thing to really keep in mind that I tell all parents is that if you have dysbiosis, if you have this imbalance in the gut bugs, it's very probable that those gut bugs are very much driving the bus in terms of what foods your child is looking for most of the time. And that blows a lot of people's minds. But I've worked with kids, autistic kids especially, who are very selective about food. They will only eat mostly carbohydrates and sugar, like bagels and goldfish crackers, and then sugary things. And that is because those are the foods that feed those pathogenic and opportunistic bacteria. They are very intelligent little species in there, and they are driving the cravings through their signals to the brain about what is going to help them thrive and survive and take over the colony. So I talk about it in terms of an actual, like an intervention for your child, because they physically can't overcome this themselves. You need to balance the microbes in order for them to be able to expand their food preferences. And it's like if your child was an alcoholic or a drug addict, you probably wouldn't have your alcohol cabinet full of all the different beverages that you would have available for company when you have over, right? People over, because your child has this addiction. And carbohydrates and sugar, in this case, and processed foods can be like this addiction for our kids. The gut bugs will actually hijack the metabolism of gluten and dairy, for example, and turn them into opioids in the body, gluteomorphins and caseomorphins, which is actually morphine within. So it is actually, or can be, a physical addiction for our kids, that these foods are the ones that they gravitate towards. So they really, really need our help and intervention in it. And I know it can be painful, but usually the pain is only a couple of weeks in terms of taking those foods out and introducing the new foods. So when we have extreme picky eaters, I often suggest people get a little bit of help, a little bit of coaching to go through that, because we sometimes have to rip the Band-Aid right off and not have those foods available. Because as long as they're available, that's what the kid's going to hold out for. And if they know they can hold out for them, they're going to. So we just take all of those foods and get them out of the house, and nobody in the family eats them. And your child, may food strike for a time, but it won't last long. So we always make sure, when I'm working with parents who have these extreme picky eaters, that we find one or two foods that's workable, that aren't processed foods, that their child will eat, that they can have on the plate, so they know their child is eating something, getting some kind of nutrition into them, as well as it's less threatening for a child to sit down to a plate and at least see one or two things on that plate that they like, or at least don't detest, than it is to sit down to something completely new. So there's always something on the plate that they can work with. And then it's just a matter of walking them through and saying, this is our new way of eating, and this is how we're going to be eating as a family. That's very important. So you're not sitting down with your child and he's got his plate of kale and beef and you've got pizza. That's not happening, because that's going to be a big battle zone, right? The whole family needs to do this for a time. And, you support the child in going through it. Sometimes we work with like an ABA therapy, so where we give like a reward for trying a certain number of bites of foods, and that can really work well with kids who are reward motivated. And sometimes in very extreme cases, we need to use the processed foods as the reward for a time. So it is, here's the pizza, and you get to eat your piece of pizza, but first you have to try 5 bites of the broccoli and the beef or whatever it is. And then you get a bite of the pizza. And then you have 5 more bites and you get a bite of the pizza. So we work this way. And that can help overcome, because there can be anxieties around food too, right? That can be a trigger of anxiety for some kids, right? So we have to really work with the child. And that's, again, where I say sometimes it's about getting a little bit of coaching help to figure out what the best approach is going to be for your child. For the most part, I've never worked with somebody where we haven't been able to get them through that process. And I've worked with a fairly complex PANS case where his rages were significant. And we were able to, with a rewards system and using the processed foods that he likes, get him to open up to trying some of these new foods, to the point where they were able to mostly crowd the processed foods out and only use them as small bits of reward. And that was enough to start to turn things around. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking, I have a lot of thoughts as you're saying that stuff. A couple of them are back to one of the things you focus on, is that those 2 things that you can control, right? So the diet and the environment. And that is one of those, in terms of it's also part of the environment. Like, as you're saying, like making this part of sort of a family culture, that we're going to do this together, and also just what's available to you. What is your fridge and sort of pantry stocked with?
Exactly.
Those are all things that you have control over. And the other piece is that, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think that, aren't there some parts of the gut that will actually crave what it is that you put into it? So that if, like, you're constantly putting in these healthy options, after some time, it's looking for that and sending these signals to your brain like, hey, where's my kale? So
Absolutely.
that you can turn that corner and build momentum from that.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a really great way to put it. And that comes back to the microflora again, because the intelligent species, when we start to feed the beneficial guys what they need, and that's the whole foods, the fiber from the vegetables and all of the things they get from that, they will start to, as they start to get a leg up again, then they'll start to drive signals to the brain saying, oh, where's my kale salad? I need more of that. And it sounds crazy, but I can tell you that from personal experience, that I changed my diet when we changed it with my son. And I eat the way he eats. And if I go traveling or something and I'm kind of off for a few days, my body starts to say, where is my big bowl of greens? Like, I need this. And I feel so good. And I love it. Like, I enjoy it taste wise, even when I get to sit down and have that big bowl of greens, because my body is used to it. And the microflora driving the cravings for that. So absolutely, you can turn that corner. You can make an absolute U-turn where your child craves that stuff instead of the opposite.
Yeah, that's so encouraging. Can you tell us a little bit briefly about this community that you've established? It's Kids Health Revolution, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So Kids Health Revolution, it's a website where I have tons of information on all the stuff we just talked about, where I go into a bit more detail in terms of, some of the gut health and parasites and other things like this that can be involved. And then in terms of the community, I've restructured it a little bit recently, because I know that one of the biggest things that most parents face when they're trying to do this is, what are we going to eat? Like, okay, this all sounds fabulous. I want to do this, but now what am I going to cook? Like, what are we going to eat? These are the things that we eat. We eat rice every day. And all, what do I do? So meal plans has been a big part of what I do working with one-on-one clients. I know I can't work with everybody one-on-one. So it's become part of what I'm offering in the community. So I offer like a meal plan, a new meal plan every month. It's a 1-week meal plan. And then once you have a few together, you can kind of, switch. We've got 4 in there so far, I think. So you've got 24 different recipes for dinner that you could choose from. So that's a good amount of variety, so that and they have beautiful pictures. So that's the great thing, because as a cook, I'm motivated by the beautiful pictures, but our kids are also motivated by beautiful pictures. So that's one of the things that I recommend in helping your kids to make the transition is sit down with them and go through something like one of these meal plans and allow them to pick out some of the dishes that they'd like to try. And if they're old enough, get them involved in helping with some of the preparation of it. And that goes a long way to getting them to buy into eating the food as well. So the meal plans are part of the community now. You can get just the meal plans, but I think the community is the really important part. So I have a level of membership where people can have like access to a private chat room, as well as we have monthly coaching calls that I do, like their Q&A type calls. So people just write in their questions or show up on the call and I answer questions that they have or problems that they're having, that kind of thing. So that's a paid membership. But there's also just a free community over on Facebook. So if all of that's a little bit too much for everybody and they're just dipping their toe in, they can go to Facebook and just look for the Kids Health Revolution private Facebook group and join that. And there's a community of parents there that help each other with questions. And there's some recipes on there as well. I call it the school snack series. I think there's 34 some odd recipes on there that people can get for free. So yeah, those are the options for people.
Well, that sounds wonderful. And I love that you have taken your own mama bear energy and channeled that into what has become this really positive place for people to learn about all this stuff, because it is complex and it is intimidating. But I think, as you were saying earlier, knowing that you have people there with you on that journey to support you, who are also going through some of the same things, can be just huge. So I thank you for that, and for coming on today and giving us some of that knowledge. And I hope that it's helpful for some folks out there.
Me too. And, I will just say on the community, if people go to the website, there's a couple of free resources they can grab right away, even if they're just sticking their toes in. And those are like a 3-day meal plan, as well as like a little ebook with recipes in them. So that's a really great way to just start seeing what kind of beautiful food is available to you. Really tasty. Doesn't mean you have to spend all day in the kitchen. So easy, like under 30-minute type recipes that are going to get you motivated and see, oh, this is actually pretty good stuff. I can do this.
You'll be craving it in no time, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right. That was Deborah Morgan. Her website is kidshealthrevolution.com. And as you heard her say, you can check that out for all kinds of easy to use recipes. And I will put that information for you in the show notes as well. A quick reminder, if you're listening to the show and you want to get in touch, don't hesitate to reach out. You can search for the Anxious Child Podcast on Facebook or Instagram, and you can also get in touch via the website, theanxiouschildpodcast.com. I love hearing from people, so don't hesitate to get in touch if you have questions or suggestions or things that you would like to hear addressed in the future on the show. Just let me know. So that's it for today. Until next time, be well and be in touch.
This podcast is not intended as medical or psychological treatment. In no way should it replace treatment from a mental health professional.